Hello, welcome back to my channel. Hi, how are you? So last year I kind of promised one booktuber that I was going to talk about this book on Goodreads. And that booktuber was Angelina from Books Do Things to Me. She messaged me hoping that I would talk about this book, and because last year I also was really behind on my wrap ups and all of that, I decided to just kind of not do any more wrap ups because I just had way too many books that I finished. But there were some interesting books that I will be talking about, and I would say this book was one of them. That being said, I actually give this book 3 out of 5 stars, so it wasn't exactly like interesting in a 5-star sense, but I do think that it is kind of interesting in the sense that it is not the kind of book that I would usually pick up. And I only picked up this book because I joined a group read organized by Katja from Page Turners with Katja, in which she organized a kind of like a monthly group read, where each month the focus would be on a different book, read around the world classics. So this was the pick in September, if I'm not mistaken. September, October, it was around that time. So so what do I think about this? I would say this book was intense. Did I actually mention the title of this book? No, I did not. But you guys will probably know the title of this book. It's in the title of this video. This is the Genealogy of Kings by Tun Sri Lanang. So the original title, Sulalat al-Salatin. That's kind of like the original title of this book. So this book was originally compiled by Tun Sri Lanang sometimes in the 17th century, and there was actually like versions of this book. I'm using the word book loosely here because this writing actually was I would say it originated from the oral tradition of narrative being passed down from person to person. So when Tun Sri Lanang compiled it, he compiled it in writing form. So yeah, this is the English version, the latest translation published by Penguin, and this one was translated by Muhammad Haji Salleh from classical Malay to English. And this is a romanticized history of on the origins of the Malay kings, and the chapters in this book, they're kind of loosely arranged in chronological order, and it sort of starts by introducing the origin of the Malay kings, like of the lineage of Malay kings. And the first chapter claims that the Malay kings were descended from a long line of kings, and that can be traced back to Alexander the Great. And as we move further in this book, as we progress further, we're getting closer and closer and closer to modern time. And that would eventually take us to the kind of like founding of various kingdoms in the Malay world, in the Malay archipelago. And towards, I would say, like half of this book, we would eventually go to the founding of Malacca. And from there, we're sort of entering into the more modern era of the Malay history, and that would eventually takes us to the glory days of Malacca Sultanate, followed by the decline of Malacca when the colonization began. The colonization of the of Malacca Sultanate began, and the colonization of Malacca Sultanate is often considered as like the starting point of the colonization history in Malaysia, even though at that time Malaysia as we know it today did not really exist. But Malacca, the Malaccan kingdom was actually big enough that it actually covered nearly the entire Malay Peninsula, and also some other areas around it, like some areas in Sumatra as well. So yeah, basically this book kind of takes us into kind of like the rough history of, or romanticized history of where the Malay kings come from, and also kind of just in general, the history of proto-Malaysia in a collection of loose narratives. Now, when I say it is a romanticized history, this book would involve a lot of magical elements, especially at the beginning. The magical elements, they seem to serve some kind of purpose. Like as you read further, you also notice that there is a kind of there is a particular purpose or agenda that this book is trying to put forward, which is kind of interesting as well. You can see that one of the common themes in this book is the legitimization of the Malay kings based on their background. And magic is one of the things that is commonly used to show that the Malay kings were mandated to be the ruler of the Malay world. And so we get many examples since the beginning of this book and in subsequent chapters where Malay kings have a certain affinity with magic, which kind of sets them apart from regular people. And related to that, there is also the relation between the Malay kings, their affinity with magic and their ability to just kind of like pass down curses in a way. And so these abilities are something that, based on this book, are used to cement the position of Malay kings as the legitimate rulers. And later on, when Islam is introduced in the Malay world, this aspect of legitimization of the Malay kings, right, would eventually incorporate element like from Islamic religion as well, where the magic of the Malay kings are tied to Islam as well, which kind of makes them not only the rulers in terms of the secular aspect of governance, but also makes them kind of like a leader in terms of the religious sphere of society in this book. So you can see those things kind of being described in a series of stories in this book. Another thing which I find kind of interesting in here is that one of the earlier chapters, it kind of mentions a covenant made by two parties, which are the descendant of a king and also the descendant of the commoner, right? And I think this part is interesting in the sense that it kind of informs us uh, on the I would say predominant attitude that the subject has towards their kings throughout the history of the feudal history of the Malay kings. So basically, loyalty is like a really big thing among the people towards their kings, and not only in this book, but if you ever were to read like works of literature that has something to do with Malay kings, you can see that loyalty is such a strong theme in all of these works. Loyalty of the people towards the kings. Well, in addition to the power that the kings have over their people. But basically, based on this book, this dynamics between ruler and people can be traced back to a covenant that was made between kind of like the individuals who were like the ancestors of these two parties. So basically, the ancestor of the king, basically, he promises that he will not, like as king, and all of his descendants who'll be the king, right? He'll not humiliate his people. Even if he wants to punish his people, he can do basically any punishment that he considers is just, is right, is reasonable, like even including like capital punishment. But humiliation is like totally out of the question. So that is kind of like what was agreed upon on the part of the king. Meanwhile, on the part of the subject would be they would always remain loyal to the king. They will not betray the king ever, even if the king turns out to be kind of like turns out to be bad. They would remain loyal to the king. So this is kind of like the agreement that they had at the time, and you can kind of see elements of this in stories about people's relationship with kings, right? In other works as well, which I find kind of interesting. The royal institution, it is still ongoing today in modern day Malaysia, and the system is kind of different than how it was practiced before. Like nowadays, Malaysia is like a collection of, it's a federation of states, right? It's made up of 13 states, and most of those states, not all of them, have their own king. So basically, the king of Malaysia would be determined like on a rotation basis every 5 years from each of the kings of those states that have kings, right? So that is kind of like how the the royal institution is kind of present in modern day Malaysia. The system is kind of different, but they are still present. And in terms of attitudes, I would say they're kind of different from what is portrayed in here, because this was like a long time ago, and nowadays is like totally different era. But in terms of the context, in terms of the people's attitude towards kings, remnants of it, I would say, still does exist, and it's kind of interesting to just kind of see the context behind it. I would say if you're not exactly familiar with kings in Malaysia or Malaysian history, many things in this book would probably come across as kind of foreign, like a little bit difficult to understand. The values that the people back then practiced in relation to how they should act towards the kings, like how they should revere the kings, and basically just other aspects of life at the time would have been quite different than the kind of values that we have in not only in modern day Malaysia but also in modern day around the world. So there are going to be those like differences in values that that you could notice if you were to read this one. So yeah, in terms of context, there is a possibility that you might be able to feel a little bit lost. So I would, I would say if you come into this book blind, you may struggle a little bit, but I do think that it's kind of rewarding as well, because by the time you finish this book, you can see that there is kind of like a progression, some kind of narrative overall in this book, which I do think is it's interesting in the sense that it gives context to the kind of Malaysia that we have today in terms of, especially in terms of the governance and also the royal institution. In terms of the stories themselves, like individual stories, I did mention that the beginning of this book had some magic in it, which may seem kind of exaggerated. Like some of those magic, yeah, they can feel unreal, but aside from the fact that the fact that they kind of serve a particular purpose to legitimize the kings themselves, right? Reading about the presence of this magic also just kind of let us know what the people back then possibly thought about their kings. But another interesting bit that I think is worth knowing is that this book, I did mention earlier that it came from mostly like oral narrative, and the written narrative was actually compiled, and the audience for the written narrative, it was compiled by a learned person, and the written work isn't exactly the kind of work that was disseminated to the general public at the time. Like, regular people at the time, those who didn't really have access to education, and there would probably be a lot of those individuals in the society at that time probably didn't get to, read the story in its written form. So there is a kind of the audience of this book would have been people who were scholarly, or at least who had access to this kind of writing. If I'm not mistaken, it wasn't really meant for regular people. So there's that. So if you ever feel like something, there's something that is just kind of like off about the content, that could probably explain part of it. Like the audience of this book were expected to be like a different group of people who had access to education, who were probably richer and all that. If you are familiar with some of the more popular Malay folklores, some of those are actually included inside here. So things such as the founding of Malacca definitely is here. The founding of Malacca, if you're familiar with the stories, actually had something to do with the Paramiswara, who was a prince from a kingdom in Sumatra. He was from Singapore. he was from Sumatra, and then he came to Singapore, and then from Singapore he went to Malacca, and it was in Malacca where he saw this kind of like this mouse deer kicking his dog, and apparently this mouse deer was like really brave. He thought that the mouse deer was like really brave, and he happened to be like sitting under a Malacca tree at the time, and so he decided to take the land where he was at the time as his kingdom, and he called it Malacca. So that was kind of the story of Malacca. There were also other stories that sort of made their way onto pop culture. Stories of a strong guy named Badang who ate the vomit of a demon, and then he became like really, really strong. So that story had been made into movies, and that story can be found here. You can also find the story of Princess of Gunung Ledang or Mount Ophir that has been turned into movies as well. So basically, kind of a rough synopsis of that story is one of the sultans of Malacca, he wants to marry this mythical princess who lives on top of the mountain called Mount Ledang or Mount Ophir. It's an actual mountain. And yeah, so when he sends his representative to visit this princess to express his intention to marry this princess just kind of low-key rejected him by requesting 7 conditions. And this compilation contains a version of this story, and I feel, if I'm not mistaken, in other classical Malay work, they also have another version of this story. I think in Hikayat Hang Tuah, they also have a version of it, which may be slightly different. I'm not sure, I've not read that. But that is certainly one of the more popular stories that have made it into the pop consciousness. They have been made into movies. Children's books have that. It's a very popular folk story. It is found here as well. So those are just kind of like some of the few folklores that were included in this one. And they're included because they have something to do with the kings that were who were the rulers at the time. So magic was quite predominant at the beginning of this book, and then eventually I noticed that the narratives would become more and more realistic or realism leaning towards the end, and that is where we're seeing the more recent history of Malacca, the glory days of Malacca, and then followed by the downfall of Malacca, contributed by various factors, things like infighting, corruption within the government, on top of the approaching colonization by the Portuguese, which really happened. It already happened like before that. The Portuguese were already started to approach Malacca and try to attack, but the colonization is considered to really start in the year 1515. So this one was actually compiled like some 100 years after the colonization of the Portuguese, of Malacca by the Portuguese. So yeah, I think it's a worthwhile book to read. Personally, I was reading it quickly, and there was a strange effect when you do it like that. I feel like this book would have been more digestible, more easier to appreciate if you were to read it slower. And they're not exactly written the way that modern novels are written. Okay, so there is this structure novel structure consideration to take into account. You can't really read this book and expect it to feel like a modern novel, because it's not. It's not a modern novel. It's a mix of, fiction and non-fiction. So yeah, definitely give this a try if you are interested in a bit of context, historical context, social context for this part of the world. Want to read something a little bit different. Yeah, so I guess that's all I'm gonna talk and say about this book. I'll see you again in a different one, so take care. Thanks for watching or listening, and bye.